The morning started like any other day in the Galactic Council building. The massive structure floated in space between three suns, and the light came through the crystal walls in rainbow colors. Kim Tae-ho walked through the long corridors carrying his datapad and wearing the simple blue uniform that all human diplomats wore. His black hair was neat and his face showed no emotion, but inside his chest his heart was beating fast. Today was the day he would deliver the final report. The report that would change everything forever. The council chamber was huge, with seats arranged in circles that went up toward the ceiling like a giant bowl. Each species had their own section, and the humans sat in the smallest area near the back. Kim Tae-ho had been coming to this room for 5 years, and he knew every corner, every shadow, every face. The Vrex delegation sat in their special chairs that looked like metal trees. Their insect bodies clicked and buzzed as they talked to each other in their clicking language. The Kaleri were beautiful with their blue skin and silver hair, but they always acted like they were better than everyone else. The Theron looked like giant birds, and they kept their feathers perfectly clean and bright. Ambassador Veltan from the Kaleri was reading something on his screen and not paying attention to anyone else. Captain Morgeth from the Vrex was arguing with his assistants about trade numbers. The Theron representative was cleaning her feathers with a small brush. Nobody was looking at Kim Tae-ho as he walked to the center of the chamber. This was normal. The other species never paid much attention to human speakers. They thought humans were weak and boring. They thought humans only complained about small problems. Kim Tae-ho reached the speaking platform and activated the microphone. The chamber slowly became quiet as the different species stopped their conversations and turned to look at him. Some of them looked annoyed that they had to listen to another human speech. He looked around the chamber one last time. His eyes found the human section where his assistant Park Min-soo sat with the other human delegates. Park Min-soo was a brilliant engineer who had helped design the communication systems that connected the entire galaxy. She gave him a small nod, and he knew she was ready. Kim Tae-ho opened his datapad and began to speak. His voice was calm and clear, and it carried through the chamber without any emotion. He talked about the trade agreements that had been broken. The Vrex had promised to share mining rights on 12 planets, but they had changed their minds after humans had already built the extraction equipment. He talked about the research projects that had been canceled. The Kaleri had asked humans to develop new medical treatments, but they had stopped the funding when the work was almost finished. He talked about the territories that had been promised to humans for colonization but were given to other species instead. He talked about the voting restrictions that kept humans from having real power in the council. Even though human technology kept the entire galactic civilization running, the other species listened, but they did not look worried. They had heard these complaints before. They thought Kim Tae-ho was just another human diplomat whining about fairness and equality, but Kim Tae-ho was not complaining, he was explaining. He told them about the communication networks that humans had built and maintained for 20 years. He told them about the medical research that had saved millions of lives across dozens of species. He told them about the fusion reactors that powered their worlds and the defensive systems that protected their space. He told them about the trade routes that human ships had opened and the diplomatic protocols that human negotiators had created. He told them about the food production systems that fed their growing populations and the water purification plants that made their colonies possible. As he spoke, the chamber became very quiet. The other species were starting to understand that this was not a normal complaint session. Kim Tae-ho was listing everything that humans had done for galactic civilization. Then he reached the end of his report. He looked up from his datapad, and his eyes swept across the chamber one final time. He said that humans had tried to be good partners. He said they had shared their knowledge and their technology freely. He said they had hoped to build something beautiful together with the other species, but he said the partnership had failed. The other species saw humans as tools to be used instead of equals to be respected. They took human innovations and gave nothing back. They made promises they never intended to keep. Kim Tae-ho said that humans had made a decision. The decision was final and could not be changed. Humans would no longer participate in galactic civilization. They would no longer share their technology or their knowledge. They would no longer maintain the systems that kept everything working. The chamber erupted in noise. The Vrex started clicking loudly. The Kaleri began shouting questions, the Therans spread their wings and made harsh cries, but Kim Tae-ho was already walking away. He had said everything he needed to say. He reached the human section and motioned for the other delegates to follow. Park Min-soo stood up and gathered her equipment. The other humans did the same. Ambassador Veltan jumped up from his seat and called out to Kim Tae-ho. He wanted to know what the humans meant by leaving. He wanted to negotiate and find a solution. Kim Tae-ho turned around one last time. He looked at the chaos in the chamber and the confused faces of the other species. He said that humans had been preparing for this moment for a long time. They had made their choice and there was nothing left to discuss then. He walked out of the chamber. Forever within hours, the evacuation began. Human ships that had been docked at council stations powered up their engines and departed. Human workers left their jobs and went to transport hubs. Human families packed their belongings and headed for the nearest spaceport Dr. Lee Sang-woo was working at, the medical research facility on Kaleri Prime. When the evacuation order came through his personal communicator, he had been developing treatments for a disease that affected 3 different species. His work could save thousands of lives, but he stopped everything and began deleting his files. The Kaleri scientists who worked with him tried to stop him. They begged him to finish the research. They promised him better funding and more resources, but Dr. Lee Sang-woo just smiled sadly and continued erasing his data engineer Choi. Dae-jin was maintaining the defense systems on the Vrex homeworld when his communicator buzzed. He was in the middle of upgrading the planetary shield generators that protected 50 million Vrex citizens. He had been working on the project for 3 years and it was almost complete, but he stopped working and began shutting down the systems. The Vrex technicians who assisted him were confused and frightened. They did not understand the human technology well enough to continue the work without him. All across the galaxy, the same scene played out again and again. Human doctors left their hospitals. Human engineers abandoned their projects. Human teachers closed their schools. Human merchants powered down their ships. Some humans had alien friends who tried to convince them to stay. Park Min-soo had worked with a Theran scientist named Kiravel for 2 years. They had become close friends and shared meals together and talked about their familia. Kiravel met Park Min-soo at the spaceport and begged her to reconsider. She said that not all aliens were bad. She said that some of them truly valued human friendship and cooperation. Park Min-soo hugged her friend and told her that the decision was not about individuals, it was about the system that had been built, the system that would never change as long as humans stayed to hold it together. The evacuation took exactly 48 hours. It was perfectly coordinated and completely silent. Human ships left from thousands of locations across the galaxy. They did not announce their destinations. They did not file flight plans. They simply vanished into the darkness between stars. The last human ship to leave was Kim Tae-ho's personal transport. He had waited to make sure that every other human was safely away before departing himself. As his ship jumped to faster-than-light speed, the communication networks that connected the galaxy began to flicker and fail. The humans were gone, and they had taken their knowledge with them. Trade Controller Var-thek sat in his office on the Vrex homeworld staring at numbers that made no sense. His forearms moved quickly across multiple data screens, but the information kept getting worse. Every day brought new problems and every solution seemed impossible. The shipping reports showed massive gaps in the trade network. Human cargo ships had carried goods between 30 different star systems. Their vessels were fast and reliable, and their crews never caused trouble. Now those routes were empty, and the Vrex ships that tried to replace them were too slow and too expensive. That clicked his mandibles in frustration. His species had always been good at making deals and counting profits, but they had never learned to build the efficient ships that humans used. Human engineering was different from Vrex engineering. It was cleaner and simpler and somehow more powerful. Captain Zorkix commanded the largest Vrex cargo fleet in the galaxy, but even his ships could not fill the gap left by human merchants. His vessels took twice as long to travel between systems and used 3 times more fuel. The profit margins that had made interstellar trade possible were disappearing. The situation was worse on the frontier worlds. Small colonies that depended on regular supply runs were starting to panic. The mining station on Kepler 442 needed new atmospheric processors, but the human company that made them had vanished. The Agricultural colony on Ross 128 was running out of seed stock that only human botanists knew how to create. Varthek tried to contact other species for help, but everyone was facing the same problems. The Theron had lost their human partners in the luxury goods trade. The Kaleri could not find replacements for the human technicians who maintained their quantum computers. Meanwhile, on Kaleri Prime, Chief Engineer Laraven was discovering how much her civilization depended on human innovation. She stood in the main power plant that provided energy for the entire planet and watched her technicians struggle with systems they did not understand. The fusion reactors were human-designed and human-built. The control systems used human programming languages, and the maintenance schedules followed human engineering principles. Dr. Park Min-soo had spent 2 years teaching Kaleri engineers the basics, but she had never shared the advanced knowledge that kept everything running smoothly. Laraven looked at the instruction manuals that Dr. Park had left behind. They were written in multiple human languages with technical terms that had no translation in Kaleri. The diagrams showed components that looked simple but contained complex mathematics that no Kaleri scientist understood. The first warning came from Reactor 7. The temperature readings were climbing beyond safe levels. The human-built safety systems were supposed to prevent overheating, but they required constant adjustments that only human engineers knew how to make. Laraven sent her best technicians to investigate, but they came back confused and frightened. They had found the problem, but they did not know how to fix it. The human maintenance logs showed that Dr. Park had been making dozens of small changes every day. Changes that seemed minor but were actually critical for keeping the reactor stable. The Kaleri engineers tried to follow the procedures in the manuals, but the instructions assumed knowledge that humans had never bothered to teach them. The humans had been so helpful and so willing to do the work themselves that no one had thought to learn the deeper principles. As the days passed, more reactors began showing problems. The power grid that supplied 50 million Kaleri citizens was slowly failing, and no one knew how to stop it. On the frontier mining colony of Thresh 7, the situation was becoming desperate. Administrator Kolnix had been sending emergency messages to the council for days, but no help was coming. The atmospheric processors that kept the air breathable were shutting down one by one. The human engineering team, led by Park Ji-won, had maintained the life support systems for 3 years. They had worked quietly and efficiently, keeping the delicate balance that allowed different species to breathe the same air. Now they were gone, and the systems were failing. Kolnix walked through the underground tunnels where 800 colonists lived and worked. The air was getting thinner and harder to breathe. The recycling plants that cleaned the atmosphere were running on emergency power, and the backup systems were failing. The human engineers had left behind technical manuals and spare parts, but no one else on the colony understood how to use them. The Vrex miners were good at digging tunnels, but they knew nothing about atmospheric chemistry. The Theron supervisors could organize work crews, but they had never learned to repair complex machinery. Engineer Talva Or was the colony's only hope. He had worked alongside Park Ji-won for 6 months and had learned some basic maintenance procedures. But when he tried to fix the failing processors, he realized how little he actually understood. The human systems were integrated in ways that seemed impossible. Every component connected to every other component through networks that required constant monitoring and adjustment. Park Ji-won had made it look easy, but she had been using knowledge that took years to acquire. Talva Or found Park Ji-won's personal logs in the engineering computer. They showed that she had been solving dozens of problems every day, problems that the other colonists never knew existed. She had been keeping the entire colony alive through her constant attention, and now that attention was gone, the colony had 2 weeks of breathable air remaining. After that, they would have to evacuate or suffocate. Kolnix sent increasingly desperate messages to the council, but the other colonies were facing similar problems, and no one had solutions back. On the Vrex Homeworld Council security chief, Drakmore was growing more frustrated with each passing day. His investigators had found no trace of the human fleet. It was as if an entire species had simply vanished into empty space. Drakmore had been tracking starships for 20 years, and he had never seen anything like this. Human vessels used the same faster-than-light technology as everyone else. They should have left traces in hyperspace that his sensors could follow, but the trails ended At the edge of Council space and disappeared, the search teams had expanded their operations to cover 300 star systems. They had checked every planet, every asteroid belt, every space station that humans had ever visited they found abandoned. Facilities and empty cargo containers, but no sign of where the humans had gone. Some of the abandoned human installations were still running. Their computers were active and their life support systems were functioning, but the facilities were completely empty. The humans had taken their people but left their technology behind. Rick Moore suspected that the humans were hiding somewhere, planning their return. He believed they would come back when they realized how much they needed galactic civilization. But as the days passed and the infrastructure problems grew worse, he began to wonder if he was wrong. The human departure was too well organized to be a spontaneous decision. They had evacuated thousands of people from hundreds of locations in perfect coordination. That kind of planning took time and resources and careful preparation, maybe. The humans had been preparing to leave for months or even years. Maybe they had been building their own civilization somewhere beyond the reach of Council sensors. Maybe they had never intended to return. The thought made Drakmore's skin crawl. If the humans were really gone forever, then the Council faced a crisis that could destroy galactic civilization. The infrastructure that connected dozens of species was failing, and no one knew how to fix it. Eton Theron, Prime Ambassador Kiravel, was reading reports from across the galaxy, and each one was worse than the last. The deep space monitoring stations that watched for threats from outside the galaxy were going offline one by one. The stations used human technology to detect ships and energy signatures across vast distances. The equipment was so advanced that it could spot a single vessel from 50 light-years away, but the systems required constant calibration, and the humans who understood them were gone. The Theron military was famous for their strategic planning and their ability to coordinate large fleets, but their entire defensive strategy depended on early warning from the monitoring stations. Without those sensors, they were blind to threats from outside. Council Space Kiravel had been friends with several human engineers, and she had always admired their quiet competence. They never boasted about their abilities or demanded recognition for their work. They simply did what needed to be done and did it better than anyone else. Now she realized that the humans had been the foundation that supported everything else. They had built the technology that kept the galaxy safe and connected and prosperous. Without them, the careful balance of galactic civilization was starting to collapse. The first cracks were appearing in the structure that had taken centuries to build, and everyone was beginning to understand that the humans had not been junior partners in galactic civilization. They had been the senior partners who had been too polite to mention it. Supreme Commander Vextalar stood in the war room of the Vrex homeworld, watching his greatest achievement crumble before his eyes. The planetary defense grid that protected 50 million citizens was failing system by system, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The massive orbital platforms that ringed the planet had been built with human technology. Engineer Choi Dae-jin had spent 3 years upgrading the old Vrex weapons with new targeting systems and power cores that could destroy enemy ships from incredible distances, but the human technology was more complex than it appeared. The targeting computers required constant micro-adjustments that only human specialists understood. The power systems needed regular recalibration using mathematics that no Vrex engineer had learned at Vextalar. Watched the status displays as defense platform after defense platform went offline. Their weapons systems were overheating, their targeting computers were giving false readings, and their shield generators were consuming too much power. Chief Technician Morkex was the best engineer in the Vrex military, but even he could not understand the human modifications. He had worked alongside Choi Dae-jin for months, but the human had never explained the deeper principles behind his designs. The instruction manuals that Choi had left behind were written in technical language that made no sense to Vrex minds. The humans thought about engineering problems in ways that were completely different from how other species approached. Thimmerkex tried to follow the maintenance procedures, but every adjustment he made seemed to cause new problems. The human systems were integrated in ways that seemed impossible to understand. Each component affected every other component through connections that were not obvious. The first platform to fail completely was Defense Station Alpha 7. Its main weapon array overloaded and exploded in a burst of plasma that could be seen from the planet's surface. The explosion destroyed equipment worth millions of credits and left a gap in the defensive grid that enemy ships could exploit. Vextalar realized that his entire military strategy was based on technology that his people did not understand without the human engineers. His advanced weapons were just expensive decorations that would fail at the worst possible moment. Meanwhile, on Kaleri Prime, the situation was becoming catastrophic. The power grid that supplied the entire planet was on the verge of total collapse. Chief Engineer Laraven had managed to stabilize some of the reactors, but new problems appeared faster than she could solve them. The fusion reactors built by human engineers were incredibly efficient, but they required perfect balance to function safely. The magnetic fields that contained the fusion plasma had to be adjusted constantly using calculations that only human physicists understood. Dr. Park Min-soo had made those adjustments automatically using her deep knowledge of plasma physics and magnetic field theory, but she had never taught the Kaleri engineers the underlying science that made her work. Possibly Laraven discovered that the human engineer had been preventing dozens of potential disasters every day. Small problems that could have cascaded into major failures were stopped before they could develop. Park had made it look effortless, but she had been using knowledge that took decades to master. The first major failure occurred at the industrial complex that manufactured computer components. The power fluctuations caused by the failing grid destroyed millions of credits worth of delicate equipment. The factory that employed 10,000 workers was forced to shut down. Similar failures began happening across the planet. Hospitals lost power during critical operations. Manufacturing plants had to halt production. Transportation systems that moved millions of people daily began breaking down. The Kaleri government declared a state of emergency and asked other species for help, but everyone was facing the same problems. The humans had built the technology that kept galactic civilization functioning, and without them, everything was slowly falling apart. On the frontier world of Thresh 7, the final countdown had begun. Administrator Kolnix gathered all the colonists in the main assembly hall and told them they had 48 hours to evacuate or they would suffocate. The atmospheric processors that kept the air breathable had finally failed completely. Engineer Tavoar had tried everything he could think of, but the human systems were too complex for him to repair. The colonists looked at each other with fear and desperation. They had spent years building their homes and their lives on this world. Now they had to abandon everything and hope that rescue ships would arrive in time. Some of the colonists were angry at the humans for leaving them to die, but others remembered how hard Park Ji-won and her team had worked to keep them safe. The human engineers had never asked for recognition or special treatment. They had simply done their jobs with quiet competence. Evacuation ships arrived just in time to save the colonists, but the mining operation that had taken 5 years to build was lost forever. The valuable minerals that could have supplied the industrial worlds would remain in the ground because no one knew how to maintain the extraction equipment across the galaxy. Similar evacuations were taking place. Colonies that had been thriving just weeks earlier were being abandoned as their life support systems failed. Space stations that had served as important trading posts were being evacuated as their power systems broke down. The Council finally began to understand the scope of the crisis. They had thought the humans were just another species that contributed to galactic civilization, but the humans had been the foundation that supported everything else. Ambassador Veltan of the Kaleri called an emergency session of the Council. The Great Chamber was only half full because many species were dealing with their own infrastructure failures. The delegates who did attend looked tired and worried. Veltan stood at the central podium where Kim Tae-ho had delivered his final speech just weeks earlier. He told the assembled delegates that they faced the greatest crisis in galactic history. The technology that connected their worlds was failing, and no one knew how to fix it. The Vrex representative complained that human merchants had abandoned profitable trade routes. The Theron delegate reported that deep space monitoring stations were going offline. The smaller species spoke of colonies that were being evacuated and industries that were shutting down, but no one had solutions. The humans had built systems that were too advanced for other species to understand. They had shared the benefits of their technology, but not the knowledge needed to maintain it. Council Speaker Zetharia tried to maintain order, but the debates grew heated. Some delegates blamed the humans for abandoning their responsibilities. Others argued that the council had treated humans unfairly and deserved what was happening. The arguments continued for hours, but nothing was accomplished. The council had no plan for replacing human technology, and no way to contact the missing species. They could only watch as the civilization they had built together slowly crumbled. Meanwhile, in the abandoned human research stations scattered across the galaxy, automated systems continued to run. Programs that had been started by human scientists continued to collect data and perform calculations. Even though no one was there to read the results, the computers contained vast amounts of knowledge about physics and engineering and medicine, but they were protected by security systems that no other species could bypass. The humans had made sure that their most important discoveries would remain. Secret Dr. Lee Sang-woo had been working on treatments for diseases that affected multiple species. His research could have saved millions of lives, but he had deleted his files before leaving. The knowledge that could have prevented future plagues was lost forever. Engineer Choi Dae-jin had been developing new defensive technologies that could have protected entire star systems, but his blueprints were locked away in computers that would accept only human biometric signatures. The humans had taken their knowledge with them and left behind only the products of that knowledge, systems that worked perfectly but could not be understood or replicated by other species. As the failures cascaded across the galaxy, the council began to realize that they had never been partners with humanity. They had been dependents who had mistaken their caretakers for servants. The humans had been quietly holding galactic civilization together, and now that they were gone, everything was falling apart. The species that had considered themselves advanced and sophisticated were discovering that they were helpless children who had been abandoned by their parents. The cascade was just beginning, and no one knew how to stop it. Fleet Commander Drakmore stood on the bridge of the massive exploration vessel, Deep Hunter, and stared at the tactical display showing the largest search operation in galactic history. 2,000 ships from dozens of species were spread across known space, following every possible trail that human vessels might have left. The search had been going on for 3 months, and they had found nothing. The human fleet had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Their ships had left no traces in hyperspace. Their communications had sent no signals, and their destinations remained a complete mystery. Drakmore had been hunting criminals and tracking smugglers for 30 years, but he had never encountered anything like this. The humans had managed to move millions of people and thousands of ships without leaving a single clue about where they had gone. The search teams had checked every system within 500 light-years of Council space. They had investigated asteroid fields and nebulae and dead stars where ships might hide. They had followed trade routes and explored uncharted regions, but every lead ended in empty space. Captain Morgeth of the Vrex Third Fleet had been searching the Outer Rim territories where human mining operations had been active. His ships had found several abandoned installations, but no sign of recent human activity. The mining stations were empty, but their equipment was still running. Automated systems continued to extract minerals from asteroids and process them into useful materials. The humans had left behind valuable resources that could have made them wealthy, but they had abandoned it all. Morgeth landed on one of the abandoned stations and walked through corridors that still echoed with the sounds of working machinery. The humans had not left in panic or desperation. They had planned their departure carefully and taken only what they needed. In the station commander's office, Morgeth found something that made his blood run cold. A series of data files that had been left behind deliberately, files that told the story of months of secret preparation. The files were recorded by Station Commander Lee Sang-woo, and they revealed that the humans had been planning their exodus for almost a year. The evacuation had not been a sudden decision made in anger. It had been a carefully coordinated operation that involved every human settlement in the galaxy. The logs showed supply caches that had been established in secret locations, communication networks that bypassed Council monitoring systems, transportation schedules that had been coordinated across hundreds of worlds. Lee Sang-woo had recorded messages explaining the preparations. His voice was calm and professional. as he described how human engineers had been secretly building evacuation infrastructure while continuing to smile and cooperate in council meetings. The humans had played a game of patience that lasted for months. They had continued to maintain alien technology and participate in council business while secretly preparing to leave forever. But the most disturbing discovery was the evidence of human capabilities that far exceeded anything the council had known. The abandoned station contained blueprints for technologies that made council science look primitive. Mergeth found designs for propulsion systems that could travel faster than light, without using hyperspace weapon systems that could destroy entire fleets with a single shot. Defensive screens that could protect planets from any conceivable attack. The humans had been holding back, sharing only the minimum technology necessary to maintain their role in galactic society. They had been capable of dominating the galaxy, but had chosen cooperation instead. The discovery sent shockwaves through the search fleet. Other teams began finding similar evidence at abandoned human installations. The humans had not been the junior partners that everyone believed them to be. They had been the senior partners who had been too polite to mention Eton. The research vessel Deep Probe Dr. Caravel was studying personal messages that humans had left behind. Brief recordings addressed to their alien friends and colleagues. The messages were not angry or bitter, but they were heartbreaking in their sadness. Park Min-soo had left a message for the Kalari engineers she had worked with. She spoke of trying to bridge the differences between species and hoping for genuine partnership. She talked about the disappointment of realizing that her alien colleagues saw her as a useful tool rather than an equal partner. Engineer Choi Dae-jin had recorded a message for the Vrex military officers he had served with. He expressed sadness at leaving, but explained that humans could no longer accept being treated as inferior when they were actually superior. The messages painted a picture of a species that had tried desperately to make the partnership work. Humans had shared their technology and their knowledge freely, hoping that other species would eventually see them as equals, but the other species had been too proud or too blind to recognize human superiority. They had taken human innovations for granted and assumed that humans were lucky to be included in galactic civilization. Dr. Yoon Hae-jin had been the council's leading expert on interspecies medicine. Her research had prevented plagues and saved millions of lives across dozens of species she had left behind. A message that explained why she had deleted all her research files. She said that her medical knowledge represented decades of human scientific advancement that had been shared freely with species that gave nothing in return. The aliens had benefited from human generosity but had never acknowledged the debt they owed. Now that the humans were gone, the medical knowledge that could have saved future lives was lost forever. The treatments that could have cured diseases affecting multiple species would never be developed. The search teams made another disturbing discovery: evidence that humans had been monitoring council communications for years. They had been listening to private conversations between alien diplomats and recording secret military communications. The humans had known about every plot and every scheme that the other species had been planning. They had been aware of the discrimination and the broken promises, but had chosen to remain silent. The monitoring systems were incredibly advanced, using quantum encryption techniques that no other species understood. The humans had been watching and listening while pretending to be ignorant of the games being played around them. Fleet Intelligence Officer Zarketh studied the monitoring logs and realized that the humans had been several steps ahead of everyone else. They had known about plans to restrict human territory before those plans were announced. They had been aware of trade agreements that would disadvantage human merchants before the negotiations even began. The humans had been playing a completely different game than everyone else. While the other species had been focused on short-term advantages and political maneuvering, the humans had been making long-term strategic decisions. The evidence showed that human leaders had been debating whether to leave for almost 2 years. They had considered multiple options, including military action and economic warfare, but had ultimately chosen the path of quiet dignity. The humans could have destroyed the council if they had wanted to. Their technology was advanced enough to defeat any combination of alien forces, but they had chosen to simply walk away and let the other species keep what remained. of galactic civilization. As the search operation continued, the Council began to understand that they were not looking for refugees or criminals. They were looking for a species that had outgrown them, a species that had moved beyond the need for galactic civilization. The humans had tried to build a galaxy worth sharing. When that failed, they had gone to build something better somewhere else. The Council was welcome to keep the old civilization if they could figure out how to make it work, but the search teams were beginning to suspect that the humans were not hiding in some remote system waiting to return. They had probably left the galaxy entirely using technologies that other species could not even imagine. The thought was terrifying. The humans had been the foundation that supported galactic civilization, and now they were gone forever. The species that remained would have to learn to survive without the caretakers who had made their comfortable lives possible. Commander Drakmore stood in his command center surrounded by star charts and search reports that led nowhere. The greatest search operation in galactic history had failed to find a single trace of humanity, but the failure was teaching the Council something important. The humans had not been lucky or primitive or weak. They had been the most advanced species in the galaxy, and they had been kind enough to pretend otherwise. Now the pretense was over, and the Council would have to face the truth about what they had lost. 6 months after the humans vanished, the Galactic Council faced a crisis that threatened to destroy everything they had built. Council Speaker Zetharia stood in the great chamber and looked at the empty seats where dozens of species had once gathered. The chamber was only half full now. Many species had withdrawn from Council space, entirely unable to maintain their civilization without human technology. The Altair Confederation had collapsed when their communication networks failed. The Centauri Alliance had broken apart when their trade routes became unprofitable. The species that remained were struggling to survive. The Vrex Consortium had lost 60% of its trade revenue. The Kaleri homeworld was experiencing rolling blackouts. As their power grid continued to fail, the Theran military was blind to external threats as their monitoring stations went dark. Ambassador Veltan of the Kaleri looked older than his years. His blue skin had turned pale, and his silver hair had begun to fall out from stress. He had been working 8 hours a day trying to save his civilization, but every solution led to new problems. The Kaleri had tried to reverse engineer human technology, but their scientists could not understand the principles behind human innovations. The fusion reactors that powered their world used physics that seemed to violate the laws of nature. Dr. Park Minsu had built systems that were incredibly efficient but impossibly complex. The magnetic field generators that contained the fusion plasma required constant adjustment using mathematical equations that no Kaleri physicist could solve. The Kaleri had hired experts from other species to help them, but no one understood human engineering. The Vrex were good at building sturdy machines, but their technology was crude compared to human designs. The Theran were skilled at organizing large projects, but they had no experience with advanced physics. Trade controller Vardek of the Vrex had watched his shipping empire crumble as trade routes that had been profitable for decades became impossible to maintain. Human cargo ships had been 3 times more efficient than Vrex vessels, and their crews had charged half the price. The Vrex had tried to build new ships using human designs, but they lacked the manufacturing capabilities. The materials that humans used were produced by processes that required precise control of temperature and pressure. The Vrex industrial base was not advanced enough to replicate human manufacturing techniques. The smaller species that had depended on Council protection were beginning to panic. The Rigel Mining Guild had lost contact with half their operations. The Vega Agricultural Collective was facing starvation. As their automated farming systems failed, the crisis was not just technological but economic. The galactic economy had been based on human innovation and human efficiency. Without humans to maintain the systems that connected different worlds, trade was becoming impossible. Captain Morgeth had been studying the abandoned human installations for months, trying to understand how they had worked. He had found evidence of technologies that seemed like magic compared to what other species could build. The humans had developed matter converters that could transform any element into any other element. They had built computers that could process information at the speed of light. They had created medical scanners that could diagnose diseases. before symptoms appeared, but the most shocking discovery was in the weapons research facilities. The humans had been developing technologies that could destroy entire star systems. They had created devices that could manipulate gravity and time. And space itself, the weapons were not built for conquest but for defense. The humans had been preparing to protect themselves from threats that other species could not even imagine. They had been thinking on a scale that dwarfed the petty politics of the council. Engineer Colvex of the Calari made the most disturbing discovery of all. In the deepest levels of a human research station, he found plans for technologies that went far beyond anything the council had ever seen. The humans had been working on projects that involved manipulating the fundamental forces of the universe. They had been trying to create new forms of energy that could power entire galaxies. They had been developing transportation systems that could move between dimensions. The plans were incomplete, but they showed that human science was centuries ahead of everyone else. The humans had been holding back not just their technology, but their entire understanding of how the universe worked. Colvex realized that the humans had been like adults surrounded by children. They had been sharing toys and games while keeping their real capabilities hidden. The other species had been playing at civilization while the humans had been preparing for something much greater. The council finally understood that they had not been partners with humanity. They had been dependents who had mistaken their caretakers for servants. The humans had been maintaining galactic civilization out of kindness, not necessity. The search teams brought back more evidence of human preparations. The humans had been building massive structures in the empty regions between galaxies, structures that dwarfed the largest space stations and used technologies that seemed impossible long range. Sensors had detected energy signatures that burned brighter than stars. The humans were building something out there in the darkness, something that made their old council installations look like primitive camps. The council tried to send messages to the human constructions but received no response. The humans were not ignoring the messages, they were simply beyond the reach of council communication technology. The few messages that did reach human space were returned with brief responses that were polite but final. The humans wished the council well, but they had moved on to other projects. They had no interest in returning to a civilization that had never appreciated their contributions, the younger species that had looked up to the council as a model of advanced civilization began to question everything they had believed. The council had presented itself as the pinnacle of galactic achievement, but it had been dependent on a species that most members had barely noticed. The Altair Confederation sent a final message before withdrawing from council space. They said that if the humans were not good enough for the council, then the council was not good enough for them. They would try to find the humans and ask to join their new civilization. Similar messages came from smaller species across the galaxy. They were abandoning the council and seeking out the humans who had been the real power behind galactic civilization. The council faced a choice. They could admit that they had been wrong and try to rebuild their relationship with humanity, or they could continue to pretend that they were the advanced civilization and try to survive without the species that had made them possible, but the humans had made the choice for them. The messages from human space became less frequent and then stopped entirely. The humans had moved beyond the need for galactic civilization, and they were not coming back. Council Speaker Zepharia stood in the nearly empty chamber and tried to address the few delegates who remained. She spoke of rebuilding and recovery and finding new solutions to their problems. But everyone knew the truth. The golden age of galactic civilization was over. The humans had been the foundation that supported everything else, and without them the careful balance of interspecies cooperation was collapsing. The council could try to maintain what remained of their civilization, but they would never again achieve the prosperity and security that humanity had made possible. They had been given a gift beyond price, and they had thrown it away through pride and ignorance. The reckoning had come, and the bill was higher than anyone had imagined. The humans had been the senior partners in galactic civilization, and now the junior partners would have to learn to survive on their own. The age of human guidance was over, and the age of alien struggle was about to begin. 2 years after the silent Exodus, Ambassador Veltan stood alone in the great council chamber that had once been filled with the voices of dozens of species. The massive room felt empty and cold, with only a handful of delegates scattered across. Seats that had once been packed with alien diplomats, the Galactic Council was a shadow of its former self-trade. Between worlds had dropped by 70% and many species had withdrawn from Council space entirely. The grand dream of galactic unity had withered along with the infrastructure that had supported it. Veltan looked at the central podium where Kim Tae-ho had delivered his final speech. The human ambassador had stood there with quiet dignity and explained why his species was leaving. No one had listened then, but everyone understood now. The chamber walls still displayed the council motto, unity through diversity, but the words felt hollow without the species that had made unity possible. The humans had been the glue that held different civilizations together, and without them everything was falling apart. The morning reports painted a picture of continuing decline. The Vrex Consortium was selling off assets to pay for basic services the Kaleri homeworld was importing power from other systems because their reactors could not be repaired. The Theran military was using outdated equipment because their advanced weapons had broken down. Chief Engineer Laraven had become the unofficial leader of the technological recovery effort, but her team was fighting a losing battle. Every month brought new system failures, and every repair attempt revealed how little they understood about human engineering. The fusion reactors that Dr. Park Min-soo had built were still running, but they were operating at reduced efficiency. The magnetic field generators that contained the plasma were slowly drifting out of alignment, and no one knew how to fix them. Laraven had spent months studying the technical manuals that Park had left behind, but the instructions assumed knowledge that humans had never bothered to teach. The mathematics that governed fusion physics were beyond anything that Kaleri scientists had learned. The Kaleri had contacted universities on other worlds seeking help, but every species was facing similar problems. The humans had been the teachers and the other species had been the students. Now the teachers were gone and the students were trying to remember lessons they had never fully understood. Younger Kaleri engineers were frustrated with the older generation who had been content to let humans handle the difficult problems. Engineer Kolvex had been working with human technology for years, but he had never asked the deeper questions about how it worked. A generational conflict was happening across the galaxy. Species that had relied on human expertise were discovering that their own experts were not as knowledgeable as they had believed. The comfortable assumption that aliens could understand anything humans could build had been proven wrong. Trade controller Var-Thek had been forced to abandon most of the shipping routes that had made his fortune. The efficient human cargo ships that had carried goods between star systems had been replaced by slower alien vessels that burned more fuel and carried smaller loads. The Vrex had tried to build new ships using human designs, but they lacked the manufacturing capabilities. The materials that humans used required precise control of molecular structure. The Vrex industrial base was not advanced enough to replicate human manufacturing techniques. The shipping routes that remained were served by old-fashioned vessels that took twice as long to travel between systems and charged 3 times as much for cargo. The interstellar economy that had flourished under human management was slowly strangling itself. The smaller species that had depended on council protection were facing the harshest reality. The mining colonies that had been supplied by human ships were running out of basic necessities. The agricultural worlds that had used human technology were experiencing crop failures. The Rigel Mining Guild had lost contact with their most profitable operations. The automated mining equipment that had been maintained by human technicians was breaking down, and no one knew how to repair it. The Vega Agricultural Collective was facing starvation as their crop management systems failed. The genetic modifications that had allowed them to grow food in hostile environments required constant monitoring by human biologists. Some of the smaller species had tried to find the humans and ask for help, but their search efforts had been even less successful than the Council's major operation. The humans had vanished completely, leaving no traces that alien technology could follow. The few species that claimed to have detected signs of human activity reported massive energy signatures in the space between galaxies, structures that were larger than planets and used technologies that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Long-range sensors had detected Gravitational anomalies that suggested the humans were building something enormous out there in the darkness. Something that made their old council installations look like primitive settlements. The scale of human construction was difficult to comprehend. The energy sources that powered their new civilization burned brighter than entire star systems. The materials they were using existed in forms that alien science could not identify. Captain Morg F. Ha.